Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're going to be talking all things Third Age with an emphasis on the Order of the Wizards, also known as the Istari. And with me to discuss these topics is AM the Wise, back for more.
Yes, I'm donning the mantle of head of the council for tonight's discussion. Yes, just to say thank you, Connor, very much for having me on. And I did a series a long time ago, or hosted a series a long time ago on my channel called Ardoranye, the history of Ardor, or the history of Middle Earth. And it stopped with the Second Age, so it seems rather serendipitous that we're coming back today to discuss the Third Age. So thanks once more for the opportunity.
It's a pleasure to have you. Did you ever plan on continuing or into the Third Age, or was the end of the Second Age a real hard stop for you regarding that series?
Well, the basis of it was pertaining to the Silmarillion, and of course, the Rings of Power includes the Third Age, but only with about sort of 10 pages worth of material. Of course, there was additional material relating to the history of Middle Earth, but that was the foundation of the sort of series. So maybe, and there's no sort of hard like limit preventing me going back and doing more to it. But as the series currently stands, it's just up to the end of the Second Age.
What is it called? It's called the Arduranye. I can't.
Ardoranye, the history of Ardor, or the history of Middle Earth. It was my best attempt to try and formulate a subject from Quenya, but there we are.
So, did you create that word, or was that a word prior in
Well, I mean,
Tolkien's work?
I just combined Tolkien's words together. So
Oh, okay, yeah. Uh, awesome. And you did that with Nathan Hood and Mr. Patriarch. And was anybody else participating in that?
there may have been, but to be honest, it was so long ago I can't quite remember. But those are the two big ones, yeah.
Ancient history a little bit, but it really was great to have that series during the Rings of Power fiasco. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Now, regarding just how you got into Lord of the Rings, I feel like people would like to know a little bit. Just did you get the book first, or did you watch the movies first?
Okay, I mean, I was a child when the films were coming out. So when did the first film come out? Was it 1999?
Wasn't
Something
it
around that? Yeah.
2000? I thought it was
I
like
think it was 1999, 2001, and 2003, if memory serves.
okay.
It might have been 2000. I may be wrong, but the point was I was only like 4 or 5 at the time. So I watched the films first, then came back to the books a couple of years later.
Yeah. I had a mix. I really was I came into the Lord of the Rings world uh almost around college, and I read The Hobbit first, and then I read sort of parts of Lord of the Rings, as well as watched like one of the movies, and then I finished the Lord of the Rings books, and then I watched the rest of the movies. I don't know why I did that, but yes, I came to it late, even though like I also was. I think I was younger than you when it came out, and my I always thought it was like a horror movie originally, because I think it's because Peter Jackson did horror previously.
I mean, you can see like the first act of the Fellowship of the Ring certainly as horror, with the chasing of the Nazgul and the mine, and later on even with the mines of Moria and the orcs and the Balrog. You can definitely see it, and that's probably the reason why it's my favorite of the three films. But it was interesting, isn't it, that you not exposed to it just as a pop culture phenomenon at all until you got to university?
I no, I well, so no one really talked about it. Star Wars was more of conversation in pop culture for me. I'm trying to think of anything else. I just saw trailers back old trailers that I remember in my, you know, vividly. I remember, and like just being sort of afraid, I think, because I was so young, and I think Shelob and like hobbits being in holes and stuff, not like living in holes, but in the sense of like Bilbo finding the ring in a mountain and stuff like that. Just uh, I don't know, wasn't really the most enticing thing as a kid, and none of my family members even like knew anything about Lord of the Rings. So
That's interesting.
yeah, I wonder if also it's a little bit of difference with like England versus America. Do you think that's possible?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
Okay.
Star Wars was as big over here as I'm sure it was over there.
What I mean by that is like because Tolkien was or is English, that it might have had more widespread or more likely to influence the older generations than
I mean, there may have been more Tolkien readers, original Tolkien readers. We're talking like the 1960s per capita around here. But I think in terms of the actual worldwide audience, gobbling up these films, I think it was pretty big in the US as far as I can tell.
Sure, yeah, it just wasn't for whatever reason in my world. But yeah, so let's get into the third age just in the basics. Let me pull up. I almost forgot that I had a PowerPoint for this. Hold on. So can you just give us a little bit of kind of where you left off with the second age, if you want? Sort of bring us into the third age.
Yeah, certainly. So the Second Age pertains to two things: the rise and fall of the Kingdom of Numenor and the creation of the Rings of Power. And both essentially form the prelude to all these sort of thematic elements and the events in the Third Age. So, in the course of that, Numenor is subverted by Sauron. The Númenóreans, under the leadership of Ar-Pharazôn and Sauron, attempt to assault heaven itself, Aman Vala, Valinor, and I'm getting this corrected as Valinor, just in case I'm going completely insane. Yes,
Yes.
and that ends in disaster, and Numenor is destroyed, Atlantis style afterwards. And it is two of the princes of Numenor, Elendil and his son Isildur, who take the sapling of the great tree of Numenor, and it forms some sort of allegory for the creations of the kingdom of Gondor and Arnor, the alliance between the elf friends of the Númenóreans and the elves, who then are able to defeat the later incarnation of Sauron and not destroy the ring, which is essentially the source of his power, but rather the ring and the spirit of Saruman languishes among the sort of people of Middle Earth for 3,000 years before it comes to the forefront of events and the story of the Hobbit and the three Lord of the Rings books.
Yes, indeed, and uh, it immediately the holding on to the ring brings about disaster for Gondor with and Arnor with Isildur's death as well. He is waylaid by orcs, which I always found a bit strange because at the in the end of like Lord of the Rings, with the destruction of Mount Doom and sort of the destruction of the armies of Sauron, you're kind of like, okay, so like why didn't the defeats at the end of the second age have the same effect regarding like the orcs? Why were there still like an army of orcs able to basically take down Isildur and just basically have the ring go into utter into the Anduin basically?
I mean, there are always sort of roaming orcs around. I mean, you have a lot of roaming orcs in the first stage and in the second age as well. Um, it really sort of depends whether they have any sort of unified leadership. So later on in the third age, as I'm sure we'll get to, a lot of orcs vassalize or sort of put themselves under the rule of the Witch King of Angmar. So there are a lot of orcs sort of ally with the forces of Harad or the Easterlings and things like that. So they're always just sort of there. It kind of depends on the organization and who's leading them, because of course Saruman has his own host of orcs as well. But you mentioned Gladden Fields. I actually, again, heresy for for speaking against Tolkien, but I always thought Gladden Fields as a plot device was a little underwhelming. I thought it perhaps would have been more interesting if Isildur almost sort of underwent some sort of I don't know, some King Solomon-esque perversion, or because again that's one of the influences of the Ring. You have King David, who obviously would be Elendil, and you have King Solomon. But of course, Solomon has his own Ring of Solomon, which, along with the Ring of Gyges and more sort of generalized allusions to the the notion of the Ring of Lordship, that is one of the key inspirations. So it would have been interesting, in my view, to see Isildur become completely corrupted by power over a longer span of time, as we see, say, for example, with Gollum or Bilbo, and then eventually completely fall into madness, or even see a civil war, and that might actually mark the division between the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor. But this is what could have been. But yes, as you said, Isildur, as a result of his holding on to the One Ring, the idea is that he is essentially betrayed to the orcs, because the ring has a will of its own, and the ring is always trying to find its way back into Mordor, and of course the orcs are always aligned with the forces of darkness.
You're not familiar with the video game Shadow of Mordor or Shadow of War or whatever it was. It was like a. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Okay, well, it's kind of interesting because that kind of is a little bit of what happens to Isildur in that game. He becomes a Nazgul. Like he
Really?
yeah, he's corrupted.
How does that work in the grand
Well,
scheme of things?
I think the point more is that he is then, like, at the end of the day, he gets handed another ring, and then when he dies, he goes into shadow, and that's really all that it doesn't go into it in the sense of what you state, where you'd want to see a long uh sort of corruption. It's more like he dies with the Nazgul ring and becomes a Nazgul.
I mean, maybe there could be an interesting plot line if I don't know, later on with Dol Guldur, the necromancer, whether a king of Gondor is raised as kind of like a corpse king, and he uses that, or a corpse steward or something like that, and therefore, you can almost see it as an analogy to what happens with Theoden. The necromancer king is puppeteering this this dead ruler in order to rule over Arnor and Gondor. But I think we're moving a bit away from the actual sort of text of the Third Age.
Sure, I just thought it was funny because, like, that to me, that your suggestion of Isildur, the Gladden Fields, and Isildur being like fully being corrupt, like instead of just sort of uh, getting his life cut short, instead of being fully corrupted. Because in some ways, it does seem like Sauron would have had maybe an easy victory if Isildur just kept the ring. Like, it almost seems like uh, the orcs are actually harmful to his overall strategy in this situation.
I mean, I don't know. I think the idea was that Sauron may have assumed that the orcs would find the ring, and they never did.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. But don't all men become corrupted by the ring? And he would, Isildur would never be able to like fully defeat Sauron again while he has the ring.
Well, this is sort of an interesting question, and I almost want to put this within the context of the lore of the Second Age, because Pharazôn, for example, never had the One Ring, but he was dominated by it regardless because he was under the influence of Sauron. So I would be interested to see how just the ring in and of itself, without Sauron assuming the role of advisor, may have affected the reign of Isildur. like I said with my going back to the Bible and the King Solomon analogy, um, baked into this whole idea of the post-Sauron order is the King of Gondor and him wrestling over the idea of dominion as opposed to essentially sort of reigning over Middle Earth, or is it to dominate Middle Earth? And that is something that Aragorn has to wrestle with. And I think in many ways it'll be more interesting if Isildur had the ring longer. Then Isildur could have become the true antithesis to Aragorn, in the sense that Aragorn essentially rules as, the idealized Arthurian or medieval king, and someone like an Isildur rules as a tyrant. You can almost see him evolving into someone like a King Herod.
Do you think Tolkien just didn't want to sort of corrupt that line in that way? Because more or less, because Isildur dies early, he isn't as much of a what's the word, like uh, a blot, like a red blot over the line of Elendil.
Or maybe it was simply a case that Tolkien was more interested in the ring than he was, because again, the whole context of the Third Age is written as essentially world building for something that was never meant to be Tolkien's lifetime occupation, which was the Hobbit sequel, which turned out to be the Lord of the Rings. And of course, it is the Lord of the Rings. It is focused around the One Ring. So I think Tolkien was more interested in finding a backstory for the ring than he was necessarily in fleshing out Isildur, because perhaps looking into what he did with Numenor, you can almost say that the story of the corrupt Numenorian king had already been told with Ar-Pharazôn. So I can understand why Tolkien chose to do it the way he did, in terms of the ring ultimately sort of being taken by Gollum in terms of a narrative sort of a focus for the story, seems to be more important than Tolkien than fleshing out the backstory of Isildur, especially as Gollum is so integral to the Hobbit.
Yeah. So would Ar-Pharazôn be more considered a Solomon-esque character then?
I wouldn't necessarily say that, because the reason I say Solomon is because Solomon had the ring, and Solomon was the successor of David. In this case, Isildur was the successor of Elendil. As with Ar-Pharazôn, I mean, Ar-Pharazôn was basically someone who dreamed of world conquest and trying to sort of get into heaven, so to speak. And then Numenor was cursed as a result of it, and destroyed for their ultimate act of sacrilege. But you can almost say that that's a very interesting story in and of itself. But like I said, I mean, we're just sort of basing this around counterfactuals. So there's really little more I can say in terms of Tolkien's intentions here.
Well, I'm not. Well, the Pharazôn part isn't counterfactual.
Oh no, as in
Uh,
Ar-Pharazôn being sort of replicated in some way onto the character of Isildur.
sure. Yeah. No, but it's interesting because Pharazôn is the golden. It just seems like Solomon also was sort of had a golden age. He did have an extreme amount of conquests, and his uh, realm more or less fell apart because of um, the things he defiled. The worshipping of other gods in the temple.
Yes, exactly. There are many parallels, and I think that is one reason why I think taking King Solomon maybe as another example and putting that on Isildur would have detracted away from the centrality of the ring in and of itself. But I mean, this stream is mainly focused on the
Yes.
Istari, but I will mention that I think that the backstory to Gondor and Arnor is in many ways far less interesting, as far as I'm concerned, compared to the story of Numenor. Um, perhaps in terms of some sort of greater dividing point in this, Isildur dramatically breaking the unity of the kingdoms, as opposed to this being a gradual process that takes place over thousands of years. But yeah, I really don't want to get too much more into that.
Sure. Well, the elves are also an important sort of aspect of the early third age, because the second and the third age are more or less the declining ages for the elves. By the fourth age, they're pretty much spent. They've pretty much declined, and the big significant decline at the third age is that they have no high king. The Eldar are basically are more or less leaderless, though they have a few leaders, whether it be Círdan, Elrond, Celeborn, and Galadriel. Those are sort of their leaders, but they don't have any real unity. They don't really have any real like driving purpose anymore. It seems like they're just on their way out.
Well, I mean, the third age really is, the after story of the after story, because the story of the elves is the story of the jewels, the War of the Jewels. It is the Silmarillion. The great high kings are the descendants of Fëanor, and they sort of meet their ruin in a sense with their great battle against Morgoth in Angband. And when we see, figures such as Elrond, half-elven, as the, brother of Elros, it really seems that the elves were intended to remain in Valinor. Essentially, once the elves woke up, they were supposed to travel across the sea and enjoy essentially immortality under the watch of the Valar. But of course, that never happened. And part of the reason why Fëanor decided to cross over into Middle-earth, into Beleriand, and fight Morgoth, was the temptation of Morgoth that all of Beleriand and Middle-earth had essentially been left as the free domain of men, and that the elves were nothing more than the slaves of the Valar. So the whole presence of the elves in Middle-earth is in many ways, you can say, an act of heresy against the gods, or in this case, the angels, and the will of Ilúvatar, because the elves do not have free will in the same way that men have free will. If there was supposed to be a natural dominion over Middle-earth, it was left to men, it was not left to the elves. The elves have their own continent, of which they were all supposed to return. So in the second age, we see the lingering elements joined together under Gil-galad, who you can say is the last vestige or remnant of the ferocity of Fëanor, the first High King to come over and establish himself as the leader of the Noldor and Beleriand. But once Gil-galad is killed, there really is no need for a High King, because there is no great enemy for which they can assail themselves against, as there was with Morgoth or as there was with Sauron. And so these enclaves, and they really are enclaves, whether we talk about Rivendell or Mirkwood or Lothlorien or the Grey Havens, this is all that remains. And a part of this story is then becoming ever more insular, especially when, say, for example, we talk about Mirkwood, which is, gone more into when we talk about Thranduil and the Hobbit. And again, all of these things have been brought up already in the Silmarillion, because the Silmarillion and the Lost Tales and all the various iterations of it, the War of the Jewels, came first. The Lord of the Rings, in many ways, is simply, an echo of that. So Thranduil has his direct counterpart in the Silmarillion, which of course is King Thingol of the Kingdom of Doriath, and the whole sort of Sindarin nationalism and the girdle of Melian and things like that. So we're taking, in the same way that Morgoth and Saruman represents a weaker version of Morgoth, the elves of Mirkwood represent a much weaker version of Doriath. So ever present in all of Tolkien's narratives is decline. The first stage was inferior to that of the age of the trees that came before it, and the second age is, of course, left to men. Men are greater in the second age than they were in the first age, but as a whole, because the elves are much sort of more renowned in their crafts compared to men because they have immortality. Numenor is lesser than Beleriand, and then of course the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor are lesser than Numenor. So everything is declining, and so the fate of the elves and themselves, these remnants, these enclaves, are also declining. And really the last decision has to be Galadriel deciding to depart and finally realize that her own desire for independence, that will to power, has been spent, and that she must diminish and go into the West.
So are they still searching for power in the Third Age? To me, it seems almost like Tolkien doesn't actually have a real purpose for the elves still being there.
Well, like I said, they are the remnants of the remnants. They are the ones who survived, living essentially in the shadows of their much more illustrious forebears. It's something that Theoden says verbatim. You know, he's the lesser son of greater scions. And that's the same with the elves, and that's the same with men, except men have a opportunity for reform and redemption, which isn't really offered to the elves, because there is a set path for the elves, which is to return finally to Valinor. As for Tolkien's intentions behind them, it was clearly, as we're going to get into the Istari, to help shepherd essentially the final will of Ilúvatar, which was to leave Middle Earth to the as the domain of men, and a realization of that.
So are the elves of Mirkwood kind of the most dissident of the elves remaining?
But you also have to put this in the context that we're talking about a series of books which Tolkien never necessarily considered to have, perfect consistency in lore. So, like I said, Mirkwood is basically a weaker version of Doriath, which was thrown in to make it congruent with the story of Bilbo and the return to the Lonely Mountain. And of course, they don't really feature at all in the story of Lord of the Rings, and thereby allowing Tolkien to focus on the elements of the elves that he wants to more so, which is fleshing out Rivendell, which of course was in The Hobbit, and introducing the pinnacle of elfdom, which of course is Lothlorien. So within the context of his original writing intentions and the unexpected success of The Hobbit, again, I'm not quite sure what Tolkien's sort of grand narrative vision would have been for something like Mirkwood, because as I said, Doriath is much better fleshed out.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that the Mirkwood seems a little more disjointed from the rest of the elves. But we do have Legolas as a representative from Mirkwood in Lord of the Rings, though he is the least sort of he's a character with the least amount of effort put into him.
Well, to be entirely cynical, you can say that Gimli and Legolas are basically cameos, sort of left over from The Hobbit.
That sounds terrible. That makes it sound so bad. Like, at least in a real modern context of cameos.
I'm so sorry to any Tolkien fans out there.
It's just funny. So I mean, we talked a little bit about the exiled Dunedain, but they really do, you said it previously, they have a sort of a slow decline, and then Arnor is sort of sped up. Their decline is sped up because of Sauron's sending of the Witch King of Angmar, the head of the Nazgul, to basically destroy Arnor. Is there a reason?
In fairness, that actually happens much later. In the same way that Gondor loses its king and becomes united under the House of Stewards. Stewards, a little bit of sort of token Jacobitism sort of seeping in there.
Well, but like But that would be anti. He's very anti-stewards, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. It was just a Freudian slip, I think. But when it comes to Arnor, I mean, before you came on, you said you wanted to talk about various analogies and historical things. Well, you can almost look at Arnor and say that, oh, this is what happened to like the Merovingians or the Carolingians, which is they parceled out their succession among all of their sons. And so there were the three sort of great kingdoms of the Franks, or really four, which were Neustria, Austrasia, and Aquitaine, and later Burgundy. Well, of course, there are three subdivisions of Arnor. There's Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudor. And as a result of that, kind of like we see with the Merovingians and the Carolingians, their whole history then becomes the relative rankings of these kingdoms and the power relations between the rulers of these kingdoms and who has, suzerainty over whom. And the whole theme that Tolkien is trying to get across here is that men are divided and squabbling amongst themselves. The kingdom has already been divided between Gondor and Arnor, and now Arnor itself is dividing again. They are focused on petty politics all the while, allowing a complete sort of non-entity, which is the kingdom of Angmar, to become a power in and of itself. They cannot unite in the face of this power, and so Angmar destroys it. And only upon, essentially, you can say, the destruction of Fornost and Amon-Sul and the three kingdoms, do you finally have an intervention by the Gondorians to put it down? Why weren't the Gondorians there earlier, for example? It was only when they became directly threatened by an ascendant Angmar did they decide to do anything. So all of this really is to say that the kingdoms of men are tearing themselves apart, and all of these aftershocks of Sauron's defeat, one of the Nazgul coming back and being able to destroy one of the great kingdoms of men, is testament to the weakness and again the need for Elendil essentially to return and unite all the kingdoms of men under a single banner. And in terms of Tolkien's conception of regality, again, you can say that this is focused on the idea of, you can say, the unity of European civilization, the res publica Christiana under the figure of a Constantine or a Charlemagne or a single emperor holding these entities together, as opposed to them essentially destroying the unity of the race of men and allowing for themselves to be destroyed piecemeal.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. Also, the separation or the dividing up of Arnor actually happens relatively quick. Like, it's not it takes about was it maybe 100 years or so. Well, it's 1,000 years and then they split up, but it's almost like 600 years it takes, or 700 years for the three separate kingdoms to fall under Angmar's heel. So yes, they definitely are squabbling, and and you're right, it does make me just think of Charlemagne's empire falling into squabbles. And Gondor is very resistant to a possible unification with the last king of Arthedain. Arthedain, basically, I think it's Arvedui is the last king, and there's a prophecy basically that either he will become the last king or he will reunite Gondor and Arnor and he will gain a new name, which is more or less what happens to Aragorn. He reunites the two kingdoms, even though Arnor is more or less still destroyed, basically in just a remnant. The same sort of prophecy takes place, but in a victorious manner.
Well, yes, I mean, Arbadui is essentially the forerunner, isn't he, for Aragon? He is the sort of the Dunedain king. The Dunedain is the Rangers of the North. I mean, Arnor is complicated in the sense that you have not just the three kingdoms, but you also have the Elven enclaves, and of course you have the Shire. You have the larger sort of Eriad or Eregian sort of areas in the northwest. And the Dunedain are not just responsible for their own defense, they're responsible for the defense of all of these regions against, roaming bands of orcs and against evil men as well. So the wild men who, say, for example, live in the area of Dunland, etc., or the corsairs who are ravaging the coastline. And as a result of this, even baked into the traditions of the Shire, you have the notion that the High King of Arnor, or later the King of Arthedain, and the Dunedain are there to protect the Shire, and the most sort of exalted member of the Shire, but there's no really such thing as an exalted hobbit, but there's the token title of Thane of the Shire, which is given basically as a hereditary office to the Tooks. But the whole idea essentially is it commemorates this old alliance between the kingdoms of Arnor, the Dunedain, and the hobbits, and so the dissolution of the unity of the North is also a recipe for disaster for the entire region as well, which is why it's very effective in The Lord of the Rings that it is Aragorn who is essentially rekindling this old protectorship, this old alliance, through him carrying essentially the four hobbits away to Rivendell.
Interesting. Yes, and the Thane, more or less. I mean, that's a old Anglo-Saxon term, isn't it? Like it's not, Tolkien didn't make that word up, right?
No, it's established sort of Viking Germanic title.
Is it like what kind of leader is it? Do you know? Like,
A Thane, if memory serves, it's kind of like a knight or a baron.
okay, he does seem like he's almost a representation of maybe the kings of Britain, like even in a sort of modern day context. He doesn't really have any power, and the only leader of the Shire is the only real leader with power on a sort of political level is the mayor of the Shire, or the mayor of Mickle Delving.
Well, I mean, I think it's actually a testament to the idyllic conception of the Shire that all titles fall into abeyance and they become nothing more essentially than ancient sort of signifiers or holdovers. Because the Shire doesn't really do politics. At best, they do sort of squabbling and sort of into sort of family rivals, but they never break out into sort of like 15th century Italian vendettas, do they? Even though you can see, some sort of I don't know, war brewing between the Sackville Bagginses and the Brandybucks and things like that.
Well, the titles are more somewhat revived with the Scouring of the Shire, would you say?
They're new titles under Sharkey, but again, the whole purpose of the Scouring of the Shire is basically to show the Shire as its antithesis, as to see essentially the idyllic English countryside turned into an industrial, authoritarian squalor, which is essentially ruled for the benefit of outsiders. In this case, the wild men and Sharkey.
Sorry, I didn't mean like with the status quo of the Scouring of the Shire. I meant with the results after the Scouring of the Shire, with the after the Battle of Bywater. It
Yes, and
the
this, of course, would simply be, you can say, a cementing of, or rekindling rather, of that old alliance which had originally conceived of the relationship between men and the Shire. So as Tolkien's big focus regarding men is on renewal and the return of the king, this you can say is the restoration of an ancient constitutional settlement.
Yeah, and they even add a new title. I think the Thane makes Sam Gamgee's son-in-law, some whatever title of the West March or something like that, which is the Undertowers, which is like a new part of the Shire given to them by the king.
And again, that is sort of the consequence of a benevolent relationship, isn't it? That the king isn't hoarding on to all of this territory he doesn't need, rather he's conferring it sort of generously among his allies. Of course, as with everything Tolkien, he's not so naive as to imagine this will form some sort of permanent, lasting sort of settlement. All of this in turn will probably fall to repair, but we don't have an extended timeline for the fourth age to see that truly unravel. But because there's always a huge amount of cynicism pervading throughout all of Tolkien's conception of history.
He's incredibly he has incredible cynicism, but his books don't feel that cynicism. I mean, some of them do. But
Well,
Lord
only
of the Rings
because
does not.
only because of Eucatastrophe.
Yeah,
Eucatastrophe essentially saves it from being nihilistic, because Eucatastrophe essentially is the most sort of important Christian element, which is wedded into this overall historical narrative of decline, which is that all, the ascent of the beast and, the fall of the world will ultimately come to an end with the return of the king, or the second coming of Christ.
yeah. So we have the dwarves and the Northmen are sort of miscellaneous almost in some ways. Northmen not as much, but the dwarves definitely feel very miscellaneous in the Lord of the Rings and in Tolkien's work, maybe generally speaking, and because they even are sort of the adopted children of Iluvatar because they were made by Aule the smith, one of the Vala.
Yes, they were created by Aule so that a sentient being could simply appreciate the craft, and rather than essentially try and use the dwarves as, essentially as, minions of the Valar, Aule basically prostrated himself before Iluvatar as a supplicant, and thereby the dwarves became part of the overall scheme of the music of the Ainur, as opposed to Morgoth's music, which, wove themes of rebellion. The dwarves were as a consequence of the love of creation as an extension of Aule the Valar essentially wanting to live in the spirit established by Iluvatar, and thereby, even though they're susceptible to corruption, indeed, all of the races are supposed to exhibit some form of vice. In the case of the dwarves, you can say obviously it's greed, um, and their coveting of craft also means the coveting of precious metals. There is a darker aspect, of course, to this, which doesn't exist in Tolkien, but exists in Wagner, which is the Nibelungen. Essentially, you can say that the Nibelung are kind of like a midway between the orcs and the dwarves here, but Tolkien affords them much more in terms of his mythology by not allowing them to decline essentially to that state of being essentially half dwarf, half orc. But I may actually push back on the idea that they're kind of an afterthought, because I think obviously the Hobbit, Bilbo is an element of that story. He is the titular Hobbit. Nevertheless, the narrative is focused on the return of what has been lost to us, which is the restoration of the dwarven kingdom in the Lonely Mountain. There's aspects of Odysseus coming back and reclaiming his lordship over Ithaca and things like that, or even like white Russian emigres coming back and wanting to wrestle control of Russia and restore the Tsar from the evil Red Menace and things like that. All of these ideas had to be permeating through the leaf mold of the mind, as Tolkien referred to it, or the cauldron of story. Um, so the dwarves, I think, are incredibly powerful, and of course, the Arkenstone, um, the ultimate source of what is coveted for the dwarves, is again a parallel to what Tolkien would elucidate further with the story of the One Ring. So many of the significant themes which are inherited from the War of the Jewels, the Silmarils. I mean, Tolkien is obsessed with his, his shibboleths, his MacGuffins in this case, and the significance of physical objects. You can almost say that these are relics turning into idolatry, effectively. But of course, Tolkien, being a Catholic, never falls into iconoclasm. But nevertheless, there's that thin line between veneration of an artifact and idolatry, turning it into a god in and of itself. This happens with the Silmarils. It happens with Nauglamir, which is the great necklace upon which one of the Silmarils is set. It happens with the Arkenstone, and of course, it ultimately happens with the Rings of Power. And it's not just a matter of Sauron's ring, but also a matter of the elves, say, for example, collectively taking their rings off when Saruman wears his. They can't be under the control of that. So there's a lot going on with the dwarves, especially in The Hobbit, and the tragedy, which is the story of Thorin Oakenshield. But when it comes to the Lord of the Rings, Moria, again, is the first real demonstration you see of what will later happen on a much smaller scale with the scouring of the Shire. It is what has happened to our home. Our home has been desecrated. And it has been desecrated in part because of an extension of our own vices, in this case, the dwarves and greed. Whilst you have the triumph and the Lonely Mountain, Balin tries to extend that triumph by restoring the ancient kingdom of Moria. However, he fails completely in this endeavor, and the kingdom is wiped off the face of the earth. You see a much more subtle decline in the elves, but the destruction of the dwarves is completely stark. And I think you need that contrast. You need that example in order to really demonstrate to the Fellowship what the stakes are.
Yes. Well, thank you for sort of disproving my statement. I really appreciate that. I guess I was being too flippant there regarding the dwarves. I mean, they do have a maybe much more important role, as you've said, than maybe it is obvious to most people. I think because Gimli is more or less the only like dwarf character in Lord of the Rings, it's less obvious to people. But it does bring me to I don't have the quote up, so I'm probably gonna butcher it a bit. But at the end, in the one of the appendices regarding the dwarves, um, Gandalf is talking about how all of the things that take place in Gondor, the Aragorn's coronation and uh, his marrying of Arwen, could not have come to pass if he had not ran into Thorin Oakenshield by chance at the Prancing Pony. This providential element that Tolkien brings into the story.
Regarding the whole providential element, I mean, Providence in Lord of the Rings is as obscure to me as Providence is in real life. Maybe that's why it's so powerful a plot point, is that it is ever elusive. But beyond that, I don't really have any more insights to to share on the particular concept of fate, other than what Tolkien himself beautifully illustrates within the dialogue of Lord of the Rings.
Well, isn't it that more, as you said, it's hard to see, but isn't it easier to see when you're sort of looking back, sort of hindsight's 2020 kind of thing? Or do you disagree?
I mean, I could say that the same. I can say the same about history. I can weave together sort of grand narrative threads in history, but I will never go as far as to say, especially from a point of view as looking at this as a humanity and not as theology, that these events were in any way predetermined. There was a beautiful poetry about certain events in terms of the ultimate trajectory and the contradictions there, and the cruel ironies and things. But I will never go so far as to say that fate is destined. This, like I said, that's something for the theologians rather than the historians to answer.
Okay. Yeah, no, totally. It's just interesting that Tolkien is basically, reminding me that the dwarves have an important role. Otherwise, in his story, things would not have come to pass as they needed to, according to Gandalf. Now, the Northmen are probably the closest to sort of maybe regular humanity, more or less, than any. I don't think the hobbits are. I mean, you said they sort of a sort of an idealistic version of the Shire, but the Northmen seem to be more or less common men, and they are more or less pulled into maybe a sort of following, whether it be the will of Eruluvatar or sort of following goodness through their association with the Dunedain and with the dwarves, and with they don't really know much. They're not privy to a lot of the first age. Like they see the Valar as like gods and not as angels as much.
The Northmen see them as gods rather than angels, just to clarify what you mean.
Yes.
I don't think I really have that much to add on that. I mean, what's always struck, I mean, just regarding all men, what's always struck me is that the Valar and not the Istari obviously, but the Valar are there for the elves, and Eruluvatar is there for men, because the Valar are not privy to all of Eruluvatar's secrets. They do not know the fate of men, and they do not know what happens to men when they die. Whereas, obviously, with the elves, they pass into the halls of Mandos, and that itself is willed by the Valar, who are an extension of part of the will of Eruluvatar. So you can say within the context of Lord of the Rings that the Valar are essentially again, even if you look at what's the mountain, Tanaquetil, they are the Olympians to the elves, whereas Eruluvatar is Yahweh to men. He is the one God. Men are monotheistic and they believe in the angels, whereas the elves, you can say, in some roundabout way, are polytheistic, albeit with a hierarchy which places Eruluvatar as the creator.
So are you saying that? But don't the Northmen refer to them as gods, or am I misremembering that?
I haven't read The Hobbit in such a long time. I may be completely wrong
Well, I thought it was
regarding this.
Lord of the Rings.
Yes, I think they're mentioned, aren't they, in the Fellowship of the Ring, and the appendix and the appendices as well. But no, I'm sure you can bring up a quote, and I could be completely proven wrong, and that my fanfic has been completely disproven. But regarding the whole notion of them being normal men, I mean, within the Northmen themselves, there are sort of two facets in The Hobbit. One is the decline you see in the book, which is Lake Town, and then there is the ancient kingdom of Dale. And Dale, in many ways, is again an allusion to what happened with Arnor and what will ultimately happen with Gondor if the enemy were to win, in that all of these things are essentially a consequence of Tolkien having to add these lore elements into a story which wasn't intended to be the main sort of bearer of all the world building into his most acclaimed work, which is Lord of the Rings. But Bard, after slaying Smaug, becomes the King of Dale. So he is essentially the Northmen equivalent of Aragon here, because Tolkien plagiarizes these thematic elements and uses them again and again in his works. And I don't mean that as a detriment. I mean that in the sense that he believes that history is cyclical. It goes through highs and lows. It goes through turmoil and corruption before redemptive eucatastrophe. And you can almost say that the relationship between Dale and the dwarves is very similar between that of the Arnorians and the hobbits. There is a symbiotic relationship there, essentially. The hobbits essentially are completely sort of deferential towards the men, and men in turn protect them, whereas the men of Dale essentially benefit from the economy and the craft of the dwarves. And as a result, Dale and the Iron Hills and the Lonely Mountain provide a synergy for Rivanion, which the men and the Shire folk do for Eriador. So a lot of similarities, I think, if you look at the relationship between the Northmen and the dwarves.
When I mean Northmen, I'm not just referring to the Bardings, the men of Dale, but also the Rohirrim are also of that same ancestry. They're of the men who basically, I don't they must have been part of the Dane, part of the original men, but they're not really discussed until sort of as more or less wild men. Maybe are they wild men in the Second Age?
Well, Tolkien has his anachronistic elements. There are lingering facets of Tolkien's mythology of England creeping into Lord of the Rings. One element, which is the timeless element, which is the most anachronistic, is that of the Shire in and of itself. But the whole notion of Rohan is basically Tolkien philologically deconstructing what England ought to have been, which is taking the etymology of Horsa and thereby trying to conceive of England as some sort of Mercian, cavalry kingdom, which essentially is what Rohan is. But to extend that analogy, Rohan is then combined to Gondor through a vassal liege situation. And then you can bring in all of these analogies, such as the alliances between the Germanic peoples and the Romans. The most obvious example which Tolkien would use is the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, where King Theodoric, along with Flavius Aetius, fought against the forces of Attila the Hun, which of course the Catalonian Plains becomes Pelennor Fields. So all of these elements are taken and they're extrapolated and then combined to this philological deconstruction of what England ought to have been through the etymology of horse, and you arrive at Rohan.
Yes. And this is what the Istari are dealing with when they arrive. I mean, it's not as complete, the Rohirrim aren't necessarily in Rohan yet, but I mean, they arrive in the first 1,000 years, within the first 1,000 years, and the leader, as you are, am the wise, the leader of the wizards is Saruman. Now, there are 5 Maiar within the Istari. We have Saruman the White, Gandalf the Gray, Radagast the Brown, and 2 blue wizards which Tolkien goes back and forth with himself on what those names are, who they are. And now the story of how these wizards, how these
just a note on that. I mean, the names he has, there's Alatar, who is also Modinator, and there is Palando, who is also Romistamo. This is also something that carries over with the other Maya themselves. So, for example, Gandalf is also known as Mithrandir, and he has a very small role in the Silmarillion, because of course, being an immortal spirit, he is there. He's simply not in the guise of a old bearded man, in the same way that Saruman has many aliases, and he begins as Kurunir or Kurumo. Tolkien has an established tradition of using iterations of different names or perversions. So, for example, we take that to Morgoth, who of course was originally Melkor, and we apply that to Sauron himself, who was once Anatar, the bearer of gifts.
Yes, and Gandalf, the name Gandalf that we know and love, really means elf wand, and it's actually just a misunderstanding by sort of hobbits and sort of the Breeland, not understanding that he's not an elf. They think he is.
And of course, the dark, Mithrandir is again an allusion to the elf friends, who were basically seen as the good men of Numenor, as opposed to the more nationalistic warmongering of the men under Ar-Pharazôn, who were ultimately sort of seduced by the machinations of Sauron. So there's another allusion to that. But of course, the inversion of how essentially Gandalf appears towards Saruman after his fall to figures such as Grimmer Wormtongue. It's a name he gives him, which is Laugh Spell, which is the bringer of ill words, essentially. And of course, Tolkien focusing on the etymology of spell. Again, for him, it's not just conjuring magic, but it's the power of words in and of themselves. What is one of Saruman's great abilities? It is not simply that he says something and then a magical thing occurs, but rather his eloquence is so superlative so as to be able to affect men and lesser races essentially to a much greater effect than one who didn't have such exalted word form.
Do you think they are trying to get at that a little bit in the movies when he sort of he has his Saruman has his his like 1930s Germany like rallies with the orcs?
I mean, from Tolkien's point of view, we don't need that,
Sure.
because it's basically there for the benefit of the audience and to give Christopher Lee a bit of range as an actor. But because in the book, in the original Two Towers, the form of words that Saruman uses to induce and seduce is used in that scene which was cut from the film, which is when Saruman interacts with the advanced host of Rohan, including King Theoden, to try and bring them into a positive form of peace. Essentially, it would ultimately dupe them into allowing Saruman to retain his full autonomy. But you're correct, essentially. Peter Jackson was using vivid imagery to evoke a certain feeling in the audience, when in reality, Tolkien never reverts to that sort of thing, because Saruman barely appears at all in the form of which he took in the films. All of essentially the scenes involving Saruman are cut out of the theatrical releases of the films. It's all an invention, essentially, apart from the bits which are recounted, not demonstrated in terms of the actual sort of present tense, but recounted in past tense from Gandalf's memories.
Well, do you think they avoided? So I mean, in the extended edition they did have sort of the voice of Saruman chapter in, more or less, except for it ends with his death instead of just him remaining in prison, which sort of because they're cutting out the scouring of the Shire. But do you think they didn't know how to make Saruman's voice sort of magical in that sense? Because he doesn't even try to win them over.
Well, the closest thing you have to Saruman and his magic is the bellowing of the storm towards Cahadras in the Fellowship of the Ring, and also his attempts to seduce Gandalf himself to come over to the dark side. by essentially using, trickery and a cunning use of, logic and words. Yes, we can just say that, he's trying to use, political arguments, but in Tolkien's whole worldview, the art of politics is a form of magic in and of itself. As for that scene in the film, the extended version, all of the sort of fascinating elements of that are effectively cut out because they refuse to allow for Saruman to reach the culmination of his story arc, which is as Sharky in the Scouring of the Shire. But of course, they had to find a way of getting him out of the story. And of course, in the theatrical version, they don't even bother.
Yeah, which really was a gripe Christopher Lee had. He was very upset that he was
Indeed,
cut.
yeah.
Which I wouldn't want to be the one to make Christopher Lee upset at you for cutting him out of a part of the film. Not smart.
I mean, there are so many scenes, you could cut out instead of, that particular one. I mean, you can make the party scene in Rohan to celebrate the victory, cut sort of 5 minutes off that, and you're left with this. Anyway, that's a different topic entirely.
You don't even. Well, I know, but you don't even need the party scene really in Rohan.
Well, in the extended version, you have a drinking competition between Legolas and Gimli.
Yeah, exactly. Just yeah, that was unnecessary too. But yes, so back to sort of the origins of the wizards themselves. They are, I mean, so I think in some versions, Tolkien has Manwë looking for 3 emissaries, but it eventually becomes 5 emissaries of the Valar to go out and basically to unite the peoples of Middle Earth and be the enemy of Sauron. And each of them represent another of the Valar. And they are also ordered. The ordering is more or less Saruman, then Gandalf, then it's kind of murky, like Radagast, I would assume, and then the Blue Wizards are kind of.
Out of curiosity, just because I think there's a bit of back and forth over this, Saruman is Aule, and again,
Yes.
it's the devotion of craft in the same way that Aule's other vassal, of course, was Sauron, who also sort of went over to Melkor. With Radagast, it's Yavanna. Who would you say that Gandalf's mentor is in this equation?
I mean, I believe it's stated that he represents Manwë and Varda, but also Nienna.
Because I find, because I've always, again, focused on the centrality of Gandalf and the resurrection, I always assumed that in the hierarchy of patrons, it was Manwë. And I always found this rather odd that Manwë's devotee was the second in the order and not the first. Again, it's quite difficult to rationalize this, but it's almost a predetermined outcome that Saruman would be usurped in his position.
It is a very odd thing to have, so the leader, but in some ways, Manwë maybe is extremely very humble, and that might be where it comes from, because I believe, like him at Melkor, before Melkor becomes Morgoth, they're more or less like supposed to be partners, more or less supposed to be like work together, to in the sort of the forging of Arda.
Well, Melkor was the greatest of all the Valar. And you can say the fatal flaw with Manwë, who assumes the kingship after Melkor's fall, and then ultimately assumes the position of judge of Melkor after he returns and begs for clemency. The flaw with Manwë is that he cannot see evil. And the interesting thing, of course, with Gandalf is he certainly can.
Well, I think maybe the reason he's labeled as as lesser than Saruman is because he goes off and learns from the lesser Valar, like he goes to Nienna. Like that's why I said Nienna is one of his sort of um, mentors, because he learns like to deal with sorrow from Nienna. And I wonder if by virtue of him sort of leaving the service of either Manwë or Varda, he is considered lower because of that in some way.
Maybe. I mean, the same could be said about Irmo as well. It's just a combination of patrons. I don't know. I think Saruman, in terms of his backstory, is obviously supposed to be, the diminutive version of Sauron, who is in turn the diminutive version of Melkor. But it's an interesting thing to consider altogether. I think we've actually sort of brushed over the most important question, which is what are the Istari and why are they even here?
Well, I thought, did I not touch on sort of Maya part, and that the Manwë was looking for emissaries to go on their behalf to rally men and be the enemy of Sauron?
But why the need for that? I mean,
Oh,
Manwë didn't bother to do that when it came to Angband until right at the very end.
would it be because they've sort of cut themselves off in some ways to the rest of Middle Earth, not in a full sense, but in an active sense, because men, because they're more or less moving towards the dominion of men, and it seems like the Valar take a lesser and lesser active role in the world, um, as men hold dominion.
That's the interesting thing. In terms of like the inconsistencies, there is no greater challenge to the Valar than what we see with the kinslaying at Alcalonde before Fëanor crosses over to establish his dominion to fight off against Melkor and recover the jewels. And again, it's only with, you can say, the full victory of Melkor, and then the redemption essentially of the men and the elves, and the destruction of the Silmarils, and the elevation of one and Erendil essentially before they get involved at all. In the same way that when we come to the story of the Second Age with Numenor, it's defensive. Manwë and the Valar only react essentially when heaven itself is assaulted by the armies of men. So in this case, I find it interesting because the Valar are seemingly taking a preemptive step where they were very content to be hands off until essentially they were directly impacted by the whole thing, felt a direct impact as a result of the whole thing, which I always find quite interesting. And the reason I say that, my most controversial point, especially being a Catholic, is that I think Tolkien is a crypto-Gibelline. That's the only way I can explain the entire sort of basis of the Istari. Because take for example one thing: why are there 5?
Wait, first of all, remind us of Gibelline. I
Okay, okay. Very, very simply, in terms of relevance for this conversation, Gibelline believed that secular power over, the Christian world should essentially be delegated to an emperor, and the Guelphs believed that power should be afforded to the papacy.
Okay, yeah.
So why are there 5 Istari?
Isn't it more or less the Pentarchy?
Precisely, it's the Pentarchy. Yeah. It's not 12. It's not the disciples. It's 5. It's the Pentarchy. So within this conception, you can almost say they are explicitly bishops. So the leader of the Pentarchy is, of course,
the Pope.
The Pope, who in this case would be Saruman. With the Pentarchy, we see, the loss effectively of 2. I mean, it's quite difficult to sort of equate, Jerusalem in this. I would even perhaps say that Gandalf is Jerusalem and Saruman is Rome within this grand scheme. But I look at the Blue Wizards, Palando and Alatar. There are many allusions I can draw here. One of them, of course, is the loss of the Pentarchy sees, such as Antioch and Alexandria, to the advance of the Muslims. Thereby, the original Pentarchy is basically broken, and it's left to essentially Jerusalem is reclaimed, but it's basically left to Constantinople and to Rome as the last of the sort of great patriarchs, one over the Orthodox faith and one over the Catholic faith. And then there is a question of they're explicitly told essentially to go off and do missionary work, the Blue Wizards. So there's another analogy I can draw, which is that the Blue Wizards are there kind of like a stand-in for the Nestorians and the Church of the East. They go further east beyond the lands of Run and they're never heard from again. In the same way that all of these Christian cults are essentially found in Mongolia and then parts of China. And there's the mystery of Prester John,
Yes.
what ultimately happened to the ancient Christian king in the Far East. All this essentially would be the two Blue Wizards. And in various references, they are seen as the progenitor of cults of the Valar. In this case, these would be weird sort of heterodox sects of Christianity. However, there isn't a moment in Lord of the Rings where one of the Blue Wizards ultimately ends up being Genghis Khan and comes back, and Nestorianism has a brief revival.
Well, it's strange because it almost seems like the Blue Wizards could be the enemies of the Fourth Age.
Exactly, and then we can have that sort of scenario. But could you imagine it that the Gondorians represent the Crusaders in the end of the Third Age, and then the big twist is that the Blue Wizards come back representing the Mongolians, and together the Gondorians and the Blue Wizards meet and destroy Barad-dûr and defeat the forces of Mordor, which of course was the analogy drawn to the final defeat of Islam in the 13th century by the forces of the Crusaders and the Mongols.
But wouldn't the Mongols then just also begin fighting the Gondorians? So wouldn't the Blue Wizards then inevitably conflict with them as well?
Yes, but we never got that far historically. The Crusaders were defeated, and Islam culturally conquered the Mongols, so it was all a moot point anyway.
Yes, exactly. So that's really interesting, the whole Pentarchy take on it. I do want to focus a little bit on sort of what they're sort of what they are supposed to act as, just in within the story, not just within the historical comparisons. They are basically supposed to be veiled. Their power is supposed to be veiled. They are not supposed to be using their own personal power in order to force people into basically being on their side or participating in things the way they want them to be. They're not supposed to be domineering. They're supposed to be more or less guides. And the majority of, well, actually, I guess, we don't really know what happened to the Blue Wizards. The only sort of successful wizard, Gandalf, is is a wanderer. Like all of the other ones are more or less like staying in one place. Saruman starts sort of falling into bad ways when he takes over Isengard and he takes it over for himself. That's one of the signs that he is becoming power hungry. And Radagast seems to have more or less stay in one place. He's living in Mirkwood somewhere. Like his only focus is like the birds, and the animals and stuff like that. Which it's strange to me that, or I guess it's possible that Radagast is kind of he's a representative of Yavanna, and so are the Ents. The Ents are also representatives of Yavanna, but they seem to be sort of opposites. The Ents come to the aid of those who are fighting Sauron, and Radagast more or less ignores the free peoples and their plight?
I mean, if I'm going to become sort of more conspiratorial, maybe Tolkien was, looking to other Christian denominations not helping each other when they were, for example, attacked by the Ottomans or something like that. And maybe Saruman is, ultimately just an allegory for Martin Luther sowing divisions in the church while Catholic Christendom is being assaulted by the Turks. But there's something more sort of fundamental here, which is the thing I brought up before, which the focus on the Gibelline. Because this is, like I said, it's fascinating to me, and I don't recall or have read any other Tolkien scholar bringing this up, but I would actually say it's essential to Tolkien's whole worldview here. The Gibelline conception places you can say the Gibelline conception focuses on the unity of the entire church. It's a position called conciliarism, whereby the bishops have more power vis-a-vis the Pope. In the same way that you can say the pentarchy restored would be the healing of the schism in Christianity. That's one aspect to it. But another is the fact that in secular matters, the bishops are deferential towards the secular authority, whether that mean on a local level like the King of France, or on a universal level like the Emperor of Christendom, whether that be Constantine, Charlemagne, or the Holy Roman Emperor, or someone like Charles V. Why I find this fascinating is that whilst Gandalf ultimately crowns Aragorn, Gandalf never basically holds the power to dominate Middle-earth in reserve as a presupposition of him crowning Aragorn. The powers of secular dominion are freely given to Aragorn, who essentially ascends the rank of the secular ruler, with the assumption that Gandalf and any Istari who would come after him are there to mentor and to advise and to essentially gift the men with the rich lore of the Valar and indeed of other figures such as the elves, but they're not there to dominate. So come in Saruman. Saruman is the antithesis of that. And why I find this so perplexing as a Catholic is, again, it leans into the Gibelline tropes. Saruman could almost be an allegory for someone like Gregory VII, in which we see a clerical figure, one who is supposed to take a deferential position towards secular governance, entrenching himself in Isengard. What would Isengard here will basically represent the temporal dominion of the Papal States, with Isengard itself almost, you can almost say it's like a Castello Sant'Angelo, the fortress of the angels. And who is the angel here? It is Saruman. That was the great fortress of the popes. So in this situation, you could almost see that subtly, the whole sort of political and religious conception of Tolkien, essentially, views that things like the donation of Pepin, the temporal possession of Rome, Castel Sant'Angelo, all this doesn't represent spiritual power, which essentially is there to defer to the secular power of men, but it's almost there as a usurpation of power which was not theirs to begin with, which is essentially the role of Saruman. And when it comes to Saruman's betrayal of the Maya, of the Valar, of Eru Ilúvatar, the parallel that I come up with, in addition to this, Gelf-esque sort of conception of rulership, is actually a work which wasn't done by a Catholic, but by an Orthodox Christian, one Dostoevsky. In his famous Grand Inquisitor, the whole basis of the argument he posits there, which is against extreme ultramontanism, is the position that the Grand Inquisitor establishes a church state which supersedes and invalidates Christ, to the point that Christ is burnt at the stake as a heretic for defying the rule of the Grand Inquisitor. Who would be the Grand Inquisitor in Tolkien's conception here? It would be Saruman. So I find the more I think about this, the more fascinating implications this has regarding Tolkien's conception of the role of priestly figures, compared to the role of secular rulers. Because unlike, you can say, with a more paganistic conception of the king, which is that of God, spiritual overlord and secular overlord, those positions are never combined in Aragon. There is a distinction between between the priesthood of Eru Lovitar in the case of the Istari versus the secular dominion of Aragon, in a way which closely mirrors, say, for example, a Ghibelline conception of Christianity or a concept known as symphonia in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Just to put it out there, because I haven't actually heard this position, enumerated on any sort of by any other Tolkien scholar, as far as I can tell. But I think it's a valid point regardless.
I'm going to try and make sort of a rebuttal, and I want to know what you think of it. My rebuttal would be that I don't think Tolkien actually sees the sort of this that the wizards are necessarily supposed to be our conception of a spiritual hierarchy. I mean, they are part of a spiritual hierarchy, but I think what's missing is that Tolkien is looking at the world as a Christ world. I think he sees Aragorn as a Christ-like figure. I think he thinks that he's looking at Aragorn as an actual king and priest at the same time. And the reason I think this is, in a few of his letters, he talks about how the Dunedain have a Heroic sense of
Oh, no,
kingship.
just to enumerate this, the whole notion of the coronation, it's often been typified as an ordination, whereby the king is essentially made a priest. No, I want to distinguish between priest and, say, god in the case of Aragon. Aragon isn't made a god, but in a sense, he's made a religious leader in a sense, but also a secular temporal overlord. So that situation also exists within Christianity.
Yes, I just don't think he sees anybody as the Pope, because I think he sees the spiritual and the secular ruleship with under one rule with the king of the Dunedain, and that is Aragorn. He had, just as King David has, the building of the temple and the right to do sacrifice in the temple, so do the kings on Mount Mindulluin. Mount Mindulluin is more or less it is the hallowed mountain. It's the replacement of the Meneltarma, which was the holy mountain of the Numenorians. So I don't think this is necessarily, him having sort of anti papist, anti pope.
No, that's not what I mean. Because
I mean,
there's a very thin line between, again, exhibiting sort of Ghibelline sensitivities and then becoming anti-papal. I think, and again, these aren't necessarily, as you said, this is in some senses pre-Christ, but at the same, Christ is present and Christ has already come. Erendil could be Christ, Gandalf could be Christ, Aragorn could be Christ, because the illusions are all here. This world takes place in a pre-church setting. There are no sacraments, there are no clerical orders, there are no parishes, there are no congregations. There is simply an implicit understanding that there is a hierarchy of the angels, and these are missionaries, and these are advisors. This is all implicit, and obviously Saruman isn't a perfect analogy. Rather, and nor am I even saying this is anti-papist, because by the same analogy, Gandalf becomes a pope. Gandalf is the one to officiate the new kingdom, but rather Saruman essentially represents the perversion of the defense of the church, whereas Gandalf represents its pure iteration. That's what I mean. He's not anti-papist in any sense. Rather, this can be seen as, I hate to use the word allegory, but when I use the word allegory, Tolkien means it in an archaic sense where there are literal interpretations one takes away, as opposed to a more broad definition of allegory, which we perhaps better use as the word analogy, as opposed to explicit allegory. But I believe these are all subtle indications about Tolkien's belief on the nature of spiritual authority versus secular authority. The idea that there is guidance and wisdom, but those things don't therefore demonstrate that because I have knowledge and I have authority, in the sense that I have come to represent something which is higher than myself, which is Eru Ilúvatar, therefore I have power and I have right of dominion. That essentially is what Tolkien's saying. And I find that fascinating because I think it's a very subtle conception of his Catholicism seeping through, which is in no way anti-papal, but rather it's a warning against any attempt essentially by any religious figure, whether it be a pope or any sort of high priest, to basically assume the mantle of universal dominion and thereby usurp it from the true authority, which in this case would be God, which of course is Eru Ilúvatar. And so Saruman is defrocked, the symbol of his authority, the staff, is broken, he is brought down, and Gandalf is raised in his stead as what that authority ultimately should have been, which is there to essentially advise and be that source of wisdom, but not to dominate. And that's why I find it so fascinating.
Yes, and I used the wrong word. I wasn't meaning to say that what you were saying was that he was anti-papal. I was more meaning that his what I meant to say is that I'm not sure he's necessarily saying the Pope shouldn't have a domain. That's all that I was meaning by that. But yes, it's definitely a criticism of some of a spiritual leader making himself God. And yes, you're right. Gandalf really does basically become a pope. And what do you think about sort of the Saruman of many colors? It's one of the things that the movies completely, just abandon. They don't even talk about it. He's has given up on white. Is that sort of a given up on purity? Is it given up on like truth? What do you think? What is that meaning?
The explicit reference is that Saruman of many colors is more splendid and more vibrant than the white. And I think it's actually a subtle mockery as well. White, of course, is there because it's the color that he was mandated with. Again, this actually plays into the theme I brought back earlier, that he is supposed to fulfill a very certain role, and he is trying to exceed his own authority by trying to take essentially his position and aggrandize it by becoming so much more than white. He is Saruman of many colors. And yet, of course, the irony is here that he may believe he's Saruman of many colors, yet he cannot see that white is the culmination, the combination of all of these colors anyway. So essentially, he has tried to make himself greater than Saruman the White, but Saruman the White was already great as it was, which is why Gandalf retorts that he preferred white to Saruman of many colors. I think it's a rather clever mockery of Saruman and his pretensions.
I just like it as a modern sort of, it's accidental, sort of Saruman the gay, basically.
You can take that, but I don't think that was what Tolkien was thinking in the
yeah, I don't think so either.
1940s.
But it's almost it's accidental, don't you think?
What diversity is our strength? Yeah, I suppose. But you also have to remember, in terms of reading too much into that the rainbow is a Christian symbol.
Oh, yes.
And the problem, the explicit use of the rainbow by the LGBTQ plus whatever they're calling themselves, is it's like Saruman of many colors. It is a direct mockery and an attempt to subvert what was already there. instead of God's covenant, they are celebrating the breaking up of said covenant and using the same imagery, which is the movement of many colors. However, don't interrupt your enemy when they make a mistake, because of course they took that beautiful demonic sort of intention and then they decided to screw up the flag by adding all of these other horrendous elements to it.
Well, I believe they also took the biblical rainbow has one more color than the I don't know if that means much necessarily, but there is a distinction in the rainbow of the Bible. I think there are more colors, or one more color than the flag that they use. But I'm thinking it's more sort of an obscuring of truth, if that makes sense. That's kind of what I take Saruman. One of the reasons I think Saruman is of many colors.
I mean, someone in the chat is saying, they explicitly bring up, splitting white light, with a prism. So maybe that's another aspect, even though all of these colors make up white. The notion essentially is that it is a shattering at the same time as it represents a culmination. A lot of things you can bring up here, but there's a reason I'm coming on to Saruman. I find it the most tantalizing sort of thing to discuss when it comes to the Lord of the Rings, which is why I can never really forgive the films for what they do. But yes, I mean, when it comes to my analysis for Saruman, when it comes to Dostoevsky's Symphonia and the whole sort of notion of Ghibelline sensibilities, all of these positions are very subtle, and that's the sort of nature of Catholic theology. Go too far with it, and it sort of goes into heterodoxy, and ultimately into heresy. So it's very sort of important in terms to contextualize this within an understanding essentially of ecclesiastical politics, where there isn't actually a contradiction there at all. It's simply, you can say, a parable of the issue essentially with any sort of disciple or any angelic creature deciding to subvert and betray the authority upon which, and again, the purpose for which he was originally bestowed. Because who else can you think of other than the more sort of obvious Luciferian analogy that Saruman is a disciple? Saruman, of course, is Judas Iscariot.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I mean it's well done. Definitely that he is a Judas, though. In some ways, Radagast is an accidental Judas.
I mean, they play around with this in the Fellowship of the Ring, don't they? But I think the ultimate sort of assessment is that Radagast was a dupe rather than he was sort of intentionally trying to lure Gandalf into being ensnared by Saruman.
Sure. Now, do you think Radagast, I mean, is sort of a critique of the sort of environmentalism, like that environmentalism run amok, basically?
I mean, you can basically see him as, again, trying to extend this. There are aspects of, you can say, totemism and animism, definitely inherent in Radagast, which is the worship and veneration of nature in and of itself, rather than the veneration of that which created it.
And he's forced upon, like, on Saruman before they leave Valinor to come to Middle Earth. Like he's sort of the quirky, family friend that is, pushed upon you.
What do you mean by that exactly?
Like, I believe it's stated that Saruman disliked Radagast immediately. Like he didn't want him to come with him. It was there was already discord between the two. He was already seen as sort of maybe this is sort of the marital problems almost being seen between Aule and Yavanna. They are so different. Aule is all about sort of the the elements of the world, like the firmament of the world, and Yavanna is all about the things that grow in the world.
I mean, I think the most extreme example is probably Ulmo and his relationship with the rest of Valar, because again, as the Lord of the Sea, kind of like what we see with Poseidon, he's basically seen as fickle in his allegiances, and the sea can either be a friend, but it can also be a mortal enemy. So, yes, all of these elements sort of exist when it comes to the Valar, and they are replicated when it comes to the Maya. They tolerate each other. They're there to serve a specific purpose, but they have their own realms and they have their own squabbles as a result of these competing realms. And yes, you can say that the motif of nature is there in direct contradistinction versus the motif of device, the motif of wheels within wheels, of machinery, the man of skill, the man of technology, which ultimately is what Saruman becomes in Extremis when he uses Isengard as the vehicle for the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, and Radagast is the opposite, more or less.
Well, yes. I mean, it's kind of exactly what Galadriel could have become had she become sort of more extreme in terms of her protection of, the woodland realm and things like that. I don't know that Radagast, you could almost say, is kind of the weaker iteration of Tom Bombadil. If Tom Bombadil is supposed to be this primordial, timeless element which is in harmony with the environment and is supposed to, you can almost say that the eternal sort of creature of the forest, he's supposed to represent England, all of these sort of things you can wed to him, but he isn't there to be susceptible to such corrupting influences as Radagast is.
Yeah. Now, Vingal is very excited for us to talk about the Blue Wizards, and we talked about them briefly, but they are so there's a lot of mystery and a lot of elements that even Tolkien sort of goes back and forth about the Blue Wizards. So in one iteration, they're both representatives of Orome, which works really well with the fact that they go east. Orome has gone the furthest into Middle Earth, furthest east in Middle Earth than any of the other Valar. Though I would assume Manwë can see, beyond as well. But Orome has actually gone, that way previously, and then and in another iteration, they are representatives of Mandos and Nienna. And in that iteration, they are actually considered successful saboteurs of the armies of the East. Basically, the version that Tolkien envisaged regarding them succeeding would be that, even though it's not really, wouldn't be on the page anyways, that there would have been an extra army or something like that that was waylaid or that was distracted or something or other by the Blue Wizards, and that the Blue Wizards successfully lessened Sauron's power.
Yes, I mean, I've gone into this with my sort of Nestorian analogy. I don't think I can really sort of add to that in terms of establishing sort of Christian missionary activity and following beyond, you can say, the Muslim heartlands of Mesopotamia and Western Iran, and ultimately that being some sort of ideological and religious limit in terms of the expansion into those territories.
Well, your vision of this with this sort of Nestorian thing more aligns with their failure.
Yes, yes, there is a success, yet there is also a failure, because yes, we don't see all of Central Asia and Mongolia become Muslim in this situation. But we also see that the Nestorian communities over hundreds of years dwindle and dwindle into effectively becoming nothing more than novelty, which is essentially detached and lost from us, as the legend of Prester John is.
So, but in this situation, the Blue Wizards do fall. Like they they've fallen from their overall purpose by creating these cults.
Yes, exactly. And this would actually buttress the whole, if we're going to, take a Chalcedonian Christian route, which of course is the basis of sort of all the major Western denominations, Protestantism, Orthodoxy, and Catholicism. The Nestorians, I believe, were the first to sort of break with the Council of Ephesus. So that would represent the cultism and the fall originally, because Nestorianism was one of the first heterodox movements to exist.
Why do you think sort of he doesn't do anything with them necessarily? Like, he doesn't really mention them at all. He just says that Gandalf is the only one that's stayed to his purpose. Like, is it because he just doesn't see any reason to go into them? Maybe it's because it could be that he might have been thinking about them for other uses, but then got bogged down on trying to finish the Silmarillion. I don't know. It just seems very odd. It feels like a strange that he has this, just as Radagast kind of also sometimes feels like a dropped plot point or plot line.
I mean, I think Radagast is rather intrusive when it comes to the Fellowship of the Ring. I even find his presence in the narrative a bit unnecessary. So I don't really think there's really anything you can add, because the basis of the story is in the contrast between Saruman and Gandalf. Really, the three other wizards play into these, analogies which I'm drawing up, but essentially that's really all it is. And maybe these could have been fleshed out had he decided to write more stories, but ultimately, what role do they play in the central mission of the Ring? I do, however, think, in terms of bringing the Blue Wizards in, Saruman is lost to the side of light. But then there are other elements which Tolkien invents to balance the forces in Return of the King, with the siege of Minas Tirith and the Battle of Pernod Fields. And this I find very frustrating, which is, I've never liked the Army of the Dead as a plot device, even though that's supposed to augment Aragorn's role as essentially redeeming that which has been left by Isildur and uniting all of the forces around essentially his rightful kingship. And I've never really liked, the only thing, I mean, I think you have to have Dol Amroth there, because it makes Gondor seem much bigger than just Osgiliath and Minas Tirith. And this is something which is really lost in the films, is that really the only Gondor you see is basically a strip of land, a short strip of land separating two cities, and that's supposed to be a country. I mean, even in Rohan, I think you feel more immensity than you do in Gondor. It's very claustrophobic. But wouldn't it be interesting, just as another plot device, that the Blue Wizards, the mystery hangs over the story, and Gandalf essentially opines about the need for more allies against the enemy now that Sauron has turned against us, but the allies he has in mind are essentially pining for that which has been lost in, thousands of years past, which is that of the Blue Wizards. So wouldn't it therefore be interesting in terms of, you can say, the redemption of the Istari, that maybe not both of them, but or maybe both of them, come back with one of the forces, say, I don't know, the Easterlings are basically turned to the side of good. And if anything, that could actually play into Aragorn's favor, in the fact that the forces of men are finally coming round to repelling Sauron. And this would be seen as a collaborative effort. Yes, Aragorn is important in terms of bringing Theoden and bringing the army of the dead and bringing the forces of Gondor on side. But wouldn't it be interesting if members of the Istari bring men over to offer their allegiance to the new king and establish something which is actually greater than just a reassembled Gondor and Arnor, but a unification of all of the men? And this could also play in with the Kingdom of Dale, and Bard and Rovanian, the idea of the Northmen playing some story, because we have cameos from Legolas and we have cameos from Gimli. Why can't we have a Bard cameo?
Oh, the cameos, cameos. You're adding more cameos.
Yes, but when I'm using the word cameo, I'm being dismissive, but I'm also being sincere. Legolas doesn't add to the story, but Gimli definitely does, because he's that link to Thorin Oakenshield and Balin. And this, to me, would add so much to the story, because it is about the unification of all men under the king, or in this case, the High King or the Emperor, which again feeds into my idea of, the centrality of Arthur or David or Charlemagne or Constantine or whatever is not simply that he is there representing the men of the last line of Numenor, but the last line of Numenor is uniting, or attempting to unite at least, all men, redeeming all men, and thereby reinforcing the Christ tropes.
Yeah, it would have definitely reinforced sort of the whole like that the line of David or the house of Abraham would provide all of the Gentiles with sort of this with blessings.
Well, I mean, there's another way you can think of it. This could be the reunion of the 12 tribes of Israel. They're all coming back, and they're uniting the line of Abraham, all essentially all under heaven, if that makes sense. I think there are a lot of biblical analogies that one can draw. These people have been lost to us. We don't even know their names or know where they ended up, but the Blue Wizards were thought to be lost, but ultimately they have been there as almost literal shepherds to bring the flock back.
I think for Tolkien that would almost be too optimistic.
I mean, it doesn't have to be total. It can just be an allusion to it.
Well, yeah, I know, but I still think it'd be too optimistic. I think he's, he is such a pessimist regarding history and regarding, like that almost seems like almost maybe to him would be too big of a eucatastrophe.
I've never been accused of being too optimistic before.
Well, I think you just have for the first time been accused of being too optimistic.
Oh dear.
Well, so I mean, we have sort of the we've gone through all sort of the failing wizards more or less, and I mean we've touched on Gandalf as we've gone along, and one of the things that is sort of mentioned is that Gandalf, or sort of the Istari as a whole, they can only really lead the men is if these men or elves are humble enough. If they're despondent, if they aren't like willing to accept advice or counsel, they are basically lost to them because they can't force them to do anything. I think the closest in the sort of realm of forcing that happens is actually Gandalf getting Bilbo to leave the ring to Frodo. That's the closest Gandalf gets to like forcibly making somebody else do something.
I mean, in Gandalf's defense, I mean, it is best for Bilbo as well. It'll be one thing if it was an evil decision whereby he was essentially, murdering Bilbo to take the ring, but Gandalf is simultaneously doing what is needed for Middle-earth, but he's also rescuing Bilbo from the ensnarement of the ring. So yes, there is a stretch there in terms of Bilbo being pressured, if not threatened, into doing so. But it's interesting you bring up the elves and the relationship with the Istari, because the elves obviously do not consider themselves like men. They consider themselves beyond men because they are immortal and they are so much, quote unquote, wiser. I would say it's better to say they're more skilled. And the idea of the elves representing, Fëanor being the greatest of the the elven craftsmen, as the culmination of this, is pride. And so it is the pride of the elves. It is the most glorious ancestry of the descendants of Valinor itself from heaven that caused them to assure the summons of the Istari, who are basically there to be the good shepherds of men. In their view, they shouldn't be allotted the same, when all the Istari are basically doing is parroting the line which was there at the beginning of their conception, which is to return to Valinor, to make the passage across the sea. So it's very interesting, but the Istari have a completely different missionary activity towards the elves as opposed to what they do with men. And in fact, their role towards the elves isn't really that interesting, because the idea of the relationship between the angels and God to men is essentially the whole basis of which you can forge the fourth age. Whereas the only way essentially the elves can be saved is by the elves renouncing what is now the domain of men.
Yes, and yeah, there Gandalf more or less encourages them to relinquish that to the men, but also, he is also representative of what is needed, because he also, since he returns to Valinor, they also kind of return with him, as you said. Now, what's interesting is that there many of them are just very helpful. Like, many of the elves are very willing to help. So Círdan meets Gandalf when he arrives, and basically immediately gives him Narya, which Círdan's kind of a strange character, because he seems to be in some ways the most uh, reliable elf, most sort of loyal elf, yet he never even went to Valinor. So in some ways, he also like didn't deny the call to Valinor, but he also lingered at the he lingered in Middle Earth because of Thingol. But also Thingol lingered only because he married Amaya, which always confused me.
Melian, I think what's interesting with Círdan is he has the greatest sight. His sight is always set on Valinor, and essentially he is the last man to leave. Being the shepherd essentially that he is there to ensure that Valinor is always, both literally but also, metaphorically in the sight of the elves. And when the final elf has made the journey, his ultimate mission is done, and he can partake of the journey with them.
So, do you think he more or less, even though he does not go to Valinor at the beginning, does he stay? Do you think he's staying true, more or less, throughout the whole time? And he's also one of the oldest. He actually has a beard, which is very odd.
Well, view it this way: what he's doing in the Grey Havens is basically an ordeal, rather, in the same way that kingship, contrary to how some people view it, isn't simply a matter of oppression and the ability to oppress others. There is an immense weight that's put on you, a responsibility. And essentially what Círdan is doing, I think, is basically almost imprisoned, in a sense, on Middle-earth. He is there to essentially wait until all have come to an understanding that they need to make the passage, rather than, say, for example, trying to set out a dominion of his own in the Grey Havens. And so when he has finally completed his ordeal, you can say it's almost like the agony of the Grey Havens. He abdicates.
Well, you're very right about sort of the agony of the Grey Havens. I love that you said that, because it really does feel like that when you look back at all the things he experienced in the first and second age. Just all the people he basically loved, all the elves that he's loved, die horrible deaths, pretty much.
Yes, exactly. Being the long-sighted, he doesn't just have his sight on Valinor, but he has essentially seen all the suffering of the elves as well, which makes it, like I said, reinforce the idea of the agony of the Grey Havens.
Yeah, and the gifting of Narya, which is very important for the scene with Bilbo, because I don't actually think that Gandalf is like forcing Bilbo, but I think the ring Narya, though it's not actually mentioned in that moment, is part of the reason Bilbo gives up the ring, is because Narya is said to have the ability to inspire resistance against Sauron and hope, and to inspire hope, which I think is what more or less Bilbo needed at that time.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
And it augments more or less Gandalf's power, because Gandalf's power more or less is his understanding of humans, hobbits, elves. Like he cares deeply for them, so therefore he has a really good understanding. Um, and then now in the Hobbit, it seems like he seems to have like almost three jobs or three goals in the Hobbit: to fix the estrangement of elves and dwarves, more or less, to sort of create some more unity there, to destroy the dragon Smaug, by recreating sort of the kingdom of the Lonely Mountain, and then as well as he convinces the White Council to basically take on the Necromancer. And part of the interesting thing is with the White Council, the White Council isn't just, I think many people think this or don't really know necessarily, that maybe the White Council is just the Istari or the wizards, which it's not. It's actually a bunch of elves and Saruman and Gandalf. And Galadriel actually wanted Gandalf to be the head of this order, which is very interesting for what you said about the fact that Manwë shouldn't Manwë have wanted Gandalf to be the head of the Order of Wizards anyways.
Well, there's another idea that Saruman was always jealous of Gandalf for whatever reason. Perhaps again because he was there to exhibit what probably is the trait that distinguishes Gandalf from Saruman the most is probably humility. It's probably something that Saruman can never truly understand because, like the elves, he is obsessed with his craft and believes it basically sets himself apart, his expertise and indeed his innovation compared to Gandalf. But the one thing he can never possess is humility. And of course, what does Manwë exhibit? Humility. And in terms of Galadriel's, far-sightedness in this issue, you can say there's a political motive, because what is the White Council? The White Council are not the Istari. The White Council is basically a very weak confederation of notables observing the affairs of Middle Earth. It's really nothing more than that, but nevertheless, it does have a purpose in terms of guarding Middle Earth before Sauron ultimately comes back. But interestingly enough, when Sauron does come back, the White Council is basically non-existent. So yes, you can say Gandalf should be in charge because unlike Saruman, he does not covet leadership. It is a responsibility for him. And because he exhibits humility, ironically, or not ironically in terms of a Christian sense, that he should be set above all others, unlike Saruman.
And his humility is best seen in his fight with the Balrog. his willingness to sacrifice himself to providence, to fate, uh, when he goes up against a foe that he's pretty sure that he's going to, well, or that will take his life. I mean, he does win in a sense, but he also dies, which his humility and his sort of choice of death. I mean, he instead of fleeing, he chooses to take on the battle, and because he does this, the his humiliation is almost the reason for his rebirth, for his resurrection.
Yes, I mean, Christ on the cross isn't a loss, it's an exaltation. And the demonstration of that victory is the resurrection. So basically, thematically, it's identical.
And I want you, I mean, since you are AM the Wise, and you've been sort of well, you were on Academic Agents channel, and you were Peter Hitchens the White, Peter Hitchens as he was meant to be. So do you want to talk about sort of what it means for Gandalf to now be Gandalf the White, Saruman as he was meant to be?
Well, it played into a lot of, like I said, the subtle Ghibelline implications. And again, this I'm very much a sort of devotee of Dante. So I've drunk deep of the Dante lore, and of course one of his most sort of controversial books, sort of called De Monarchia, which I find and indeed, of course, being a very much an enthusiast of Dostoevsky, I will still count these as influences, but essentially my sort of Ghibelline tendencies come through here and say that Gandalf, essentially, in his position as pseudo-pope, is there to bring all, not just elves, but indeed part of the Istari and all of mankind and the hobbits, to salvation, which is ultimately what the Good Shepherd does. What is the church? The church is a path to salvation. It is the path to salvation. It's the reason why the church exists as the bride of Christ. And the Pope's most important role, therefore, is to bring everyone to salvation. It is not to dominate for the sake of domination. And you do have to bear in mind that there were archetypal popes who were like Saruman. I mean,
Oh, yes.
I think of Julius II as probably the most obvious example. The war pope, going around and forming alliances with the Italian states and going around and besieging various castles and things like that. So this idea very much exists.
Which pope was it? The one that was so bad that they dragged his body through the streets because they were so unhappy?
I mean, there's literally a period in Catholic history called the pornocracy.
Yes. I mean, definitely Saruman is a sort of a representation of the pornocracy, I think.
I don't know. I see many more comparisons on a superficial level with Julius II, but on a meta level with Gregory VII, had he gone much further. You can say the orthodox prejudice against Gregory VII, because I do not view Saruman is completely analogous to Gregory VII at all. I have a very high opinion of Gregory VII.
I'm not like my Pope history is not the best. So if you could just give a summation of.
All right. Well, this is why I find the whole usurpation argument very interesting, because the reform process against the quote-unquote pornocracy was not led by the papacy or the church. It was led by the empire. It was led by the Etonians. The Etonians were focused on the eradication of corruption within the church, not only for Christian reasons, but also for political reasons, because a benevolent, reformed, and you can say humble clergy were used by the Etonians as administrators. But basically, they were there not just as a spiritual wing of the Holy Roman Empire, they were essentially there as its governors, which I find very interesting. And the Etonian emperors were the ones essentially to chase out the Theophylacti and reclaim Rome. and they were also the ones to install the reforming popes. And after a series of popes in the second half of the 11th century, one of the greatest of the reforming popes was one Gregory VII. And Gregory VII, after essentially having been the culmination of an attempt by the empire to rejuvenate and reform Christianity, and by in itself buttress the secular authority of the emperor, Gregory then claimed temporal as well as spiritual authority over all of Christendom, including the right to depose rulers at will, and the supreme right to appoint bishops, and indeed the right to reinvigorate the practice of clerical celibacy. So his position within the history of the Catholic Church cannot be overstated, to such an extent that people actually believe that the Catholic Church isn't a continuity, but it is an innovation of Gregory VII, that there was the Church, then there was the schism, then there was the Catholic Church. Of course, that's not a view that I have, but that's simply a demonstration of the significance of Gregory VII. And the most sort of extreme example of this is Gregory basically forcing the Holy Roman Emperor to undergo a penance called the Walk to Canossa and partake of the investiture controversy, which ultimately affirmed the Pope's supreme right to appoint bishops, albeit with imperial approval. Ultimately, Gregory VII, you can say, was the summation of the reforming popes, but Saruman is, if you take that basis, take that idea of the Pope as supreme temporal overlord, which was then taken and buttressed by Innocent III about 100 years later. And that, of course, was buttressed by the idea that the popes were leading crusades, not the emperor, the popes. They were leading the wars of Christendom. Now imagine Saruman and assume that Gregory VII, Urban II, and Innocent III all had evil intent for dominion's sake and to rebel against God himself. And then you arrive at Dostoevsky's parallel, which is the Grand Inquisitor, which essentially is some form of allegory towards that, had the church basically decided that Christ was redundant, if not inconvenient, to the practice of the temporal authority of an institution. That's why I say there's a subtle element of Ghibellinism, which encroaches this entire narrative. But essentially it is, if you take all of these influences together, the Industrial Revolution, the destruction of nature, temporal power and possession over Isengard, the reforming zeal and aspirations to universal sort of Rex Mundi, king of the world, essentially. And then you sufficiently subvert them to the point that you have established a power in your own name, which of course Saruman does. And what comes across very well in the book, which doesn't come across at all well in the films, is that Saruman almost sees this as a stepping stone from which to dethrone Sauron. So this would be an anti-pope or an anti-Christ, you can almost say, as of course was something bandied about so much in the religious sort of history of the point, to the fact that Protestants were so against the Pope, they called it the whore of Babylon and associated the papacy as an institution with the Antichrist, that having basically usurped God and established his own position basically as the anti-pope, then Saruman would go on and try and dethrone Lucifer, Satan, as the lord of as the devil and basically the host of dark angels. So it's quite interesting if you look at it that way.
Yeah, that well said. It's interesting because Gandalf does seem to sort of submit to Saruman to some degree, especially leading up to his unmasking. Like it seems that Gandalf follows Saruman, especially regarding Dol Guldur, whether or not the ring, is in Middle Earth anymore. He submits to his superior until Saruman is fully unmasked, and then more or less him coming back as Gandalf the White, more or less is a divine edict to overthrow Saruman.
Yes, it's a correction. And I hate to bring in what's currently going on in the Catholic Church, but the whole notion, essentially, because I'm not going to go into this, the whole notion is loyalty, not to sort of veer towards schism until there is an explicit mask off moment, at then which there has to be a correction.
I think obedience is the better word than loyalty.
Obedience in a specific Catholic context, yes, exactly. But again, loyalty implies reciprocal obligations, but towards the pontiff, obedience, yes, you're correct.
Yes. And but yes, loyalty is for non-Catholics might be easier to understand, but yes, it's just an interesting highlight. That I think that Tolkien is somewhat trying to give people an understanding of how to deal with maybe superiors that are unjust, even though their position is more or less divinely handed down to them.
Well, Saruman's position seems unassailable, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Until he becomes the antithesis of what he was meant to be. And again, this is why I find it so wonderful about Saruman's character. Saruman is the head of the White Council. He is the leader of the Istari. He is the most exalted Mire on Middle Earth, and yet it is not enough. And so he must become Saruman of many colors, which are, again, the bitter irony there, and the sarcasm coming through. And of course, the more he tries to empower himself, the more he demands the obedience of characters like Gandalf, the weaker he becomes, the less legitimacy he has. And so every iteration towards power afterwards becomes more pathetic, to the point that you finally arrive at Sharky and his former institution being broken, and ultimately his coming to nothing. I find it very, very interesting.
I mean, he's become so pathetic that all he can muster is, you ruined my home, I'll ruin your home. You know, he basically becomes like a middle schooler.
Yeah, and it's really tragic. And if there's a parable essentially for the difficulty sometimes is living as a Catholic, I think you can't really go far with go far wrong with Lord of the Rings. But I think unfortunately this is going to be lost on people who aren't as familiar with the precepts of the church as perhaps you or I. Of course, I consider myself very much a catechumen when it comes to Tolkien studies. I'm not sort of published in any peer-reviewed things at all, but I find this very interesting to read more about and hypothesize about. But I think, as you were saying actually before, that many people look at these, you can almost say that they're shining through as Christian analogies, and people come to the conclusion that in reality Tolkien was pagan.
Well, do you want to maybe or should I bring up that Twitter thing, because we could break it down or something like that
as an ending for this? Yeah, I think that might be a good way to end that, because I'm sure people listening who aren't of our persuasion might find it a bit frustrating that we're talking about it from this angle, but we're not exactly exploring or deconstructing the other.
Yes. But yeah, so we'll come back to that at the end. So more or less, he, you said something about sort of Gandalf leading crusading armies, or well, you said the Pope more or less leading crusading armies. Don't you think that sort of Gandalf kind of takes that position with the steward? With Steward Denethor has basically embraced madness, and when he's no longer willing to lead his people, Gandalf becomes almost a temporal lord.
Yes, exactly. This is why it's not enough. This is why the Ghibelline position is so nuanced in terms of all this. Tolkien supports assertiveness, when it is essentially in favor or service of the forces of the light. So, Denethor represents, the corruption and loss of faith. Again, faith being a fundamental sort of precept of this. Denethor has lost faith, and therefore Gandalf must arise, and he must be Urban II, directing the forces of Christendom to retake the Holy Land, which is essentially what this is. Uniting, all of these sort of lesser princes of France and Italy and Germany and the Low Countries and England to go off and reclaim the Holy Land.
Yes, and when Sauron is officially defeated, I mean, it's clear that Gandalf's main plan, obviously, I think, and maybe it wasn't a definitive plan in his head, but basically to restore the kingdoms of men, restore Gondor and Arnor in order to have as well as defeat Sauron. So, and even though he's not the one to bring Sauron, he calls himself the enemy of Sauron, but it's more like his planning that undoes Sauron and Sauron's hubris, because the Hobbit, the Frodo and basically the pity of Bilbo, the pity of Frodo, it rules the day with the destruction of the ring.
I mean, regarding Aragorn's role, I mean, obviously, Sauron is pride, he is hubris, but I mean, we haven't really talked about Frodo, which is interesting in and of itself. But if Aragorn represents the the divine kingdom, the kingdom not of this world, the kingdom of heaven, Gandalf represents the resurrection, and obviously represents the papacy. Then what does Frodo represent? He represents the agony in the garden. He represents, Christ in the desert. He represents Lent, and he represents the Lamb of God, the sacrificial offering. So all of these sort of Christian concepts are wedded together. And of course, Gandalf basically assumes that role of patronage in order to basically ensure that Frodo will ultimately assume that role. And perhaps this would have been far too dark for Tolkien, but had Frodo actually died in Mount Doom? Because if we're going towards, what he gets in terms of a biblical reference is that the passage into Valinor, as with Gandalf, is the ascension, effectively. We don't see the equivalent of Pentecost afterwards, and the passage of the descent of the Holy Spirit is not made explicit. But what Aragorn's domain isn't a representation of his power, but rather the restoration of the kingdoms is simply, you can say, the culmination of peace. That's all it is. It's basically a form of order to serve the denizens, but it doesn't represent, Aragorn is not greater just for being the king of Gondor or the kingdom of Arnor, but it's simply that the restoration of these kingdoms represents the healing of the world.
Yes. Though I do think you could argue that Aragorn sort of has a element of Pentecost to it, insofar as he is sort of the leader. It is his responsibility to maintain the world after. I mean, it's more of a joint thing with all the rest of men, but he sort of has that. And the white tree, the sapling of the white tree is almost that, the symbol of that.
Well, I hate to go into more sort of imperial analogies, but you can almost say that, and I'm sorry to everyone listening, but you can almost say, I mean, obviously, the tree representing essentially the roots in the kingdom, and that it essentially embodies the world, the world tree, Yggdrasil, and again, these not just Christian, but these pagan motifs as well. That the sapling, the withering, the death, and then the renewal and the growth of the new tree, it doesn't just represent some sort of vague notion of renewal, but it also, you can say, represents Tolkien's take on translatio imperii, that the kingdom of Rome's eternal. It simply sort of transfers to other places, whether it be Byzantium to the Carolingians, and then ultimately to the Habsburgs.
Very interesting. Yes, I like that. And then, the order ends with him and Frodo, with him going off fully out of Middle Earth, and Frodo, his death, at least in my opinion, it does happen on Mount Doom, but it's more or less the how the Shire dies to him. That's why he leaves, is because he more or less saved the Shire, but not for himself, meaning the Shire more or less died for him, or died within him, I guess.
Yes, and it's tragic, and it's bittersweet, and it means that Frodo essentially went out to defend his home, but ultimately, even though the home in its physical sense was, it survived and it was reclaimed by them, home as a concept of him died, which, maybe it's the saddest element of all of Lord of the Rings, possibly.
It is very sad. I reread it recently, and I got very teary-eyed at the end. There's something about Frodo hiding the fact that he's sick from Sam. Doesn't want to burden him with that, even though Sam has basically accepted all of Frodo's burdens up until that point.
Thematically, yeah, we talk about the scouring of the Shire, but the true scouring of the Shire was actually internal Frodo.
Yes. Now, I think it's a good time for this. We can deal with this Twitter thing. So here it is. So it's got, he's got the standing up guy. I don't know what that meme's technically called, but saying something that's unpopular or whatever. He knows that he's going to be unpopular. Lord of the Rings is a masterful and edifying work, but it's certainly not a Christian. I assume he means Christian, not a Christian, or he's saying a Christian work. Rather, it fits much more comfortably in the mold of old heroic pagan epics. And interrupt me when you want.
Can I read the? Can we see the community note?
Oh yeah,
fascinating. It's been community noted.
Yes, it's been community noted. The author J.R.R. Tolkien wrote of his work in letter 142. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Now, part of me thinks, is he just saying so this guy says he's a Lutheran, right? Is he just also saying that he doesn't believe Catholics are Christians, sort of thing? Is he doing that sort of thing? I don't know, but that's
let's be more charitable, I think, than that.
Well, yeah, let's be more charitable. So just stop me whenever you want to add something to it. Through there is a whole mythology, creation story, and supreme deity in Lord of the Rings. Religion as such plays no profound part of the story. At most, a deistic conception echoes the otherwise practically secular characters. Worship, religious doctrines, and revelations are absent, and in their place, a whole host of semi-divine creatures roam the world and embodies almost exclusively all that is supernatural. That just seems bizarre to me.
Well, from a Lutheran, I find it quite bizarre that the supernatural is seen as opposed to invisible. the fundamental aspect of the Nicene Creed seems lost on him here. But maybe he means that really in a most superficial sense, that unless the gods take an active role that's, observable, they don't exist. Ergo, Iluvatar can't exist.
Yeah, I guess it just seems really strange. More worrisome is the fact that the central Christian virtues such as faith, trust in God, conversion, repentance, and sin and forgiveness are utterly absent here. In their stead, perennial natural virtues such as duty, fearlessness, self-sacrifice, loyalty, wisdom, etc., form the major underlying motives and measure points for the main characters.
Can I?
Yeah.
How does duty, fearlessness, self-sacrifice, loyalty, and wisdom? I mean, there's a very strange way in which he's described it. But how does that in any way contradict faith, hope, and charity?
I don't know. That's why it doesn't make any sense. He's completely missed the point of pretty much everything. So,
are there any interesting points that we can actually try and combat, as opposed to just things which are, you can almost say cheap arguments to sort of refute?
Yeah. A total lack of otherworldliness. That doesn't make any sense. I'm
Wait, can I read that?
sorry.
Many more things could be brought up, such as the universe's total lack of a concept of otherworldliness and a longing for personal and cosmic divine redemption, or how all the main plots are motivated by purely worldly concerns. But let it too be said, wait, there's literally an other world which Frodo and Gandalf travel to at the end.
Well, I apparently he's taking it such as like because it's part of the world in some sense, that it's not another world, even though it is separated. Like that that since you're able to get there, that it isn't another world. I don't know.
This seems like very low-hanging fruit to me.
I swear they just tried to make this guy's just trying to get people annoyed with him, or get maybe clicks or get attention or whatever. But in this way, it's not exactly getting it because he just wants comments, right?
Well, I mean, the tweet above has 16,000 views and only 36 likes. I don't think that's much in the way of engagement.
Well, no, but yeah, I guess it's not. He doesn't get terribly much, but I don't know. The wonder or beauty of the universe of Tolkien, rather, it is, in my opinion, underscores the nature of Tolkien as a supreme Neo-Germanic skald, a more gifted Anglo-Saxon bard able to compose a myth most fitting for the old thought world and soul of Germanic peoples. I mean, is it not just a
this is relying on almost exclusively on the fact that Tolkien was the foremost sort of exponent of, Beowulf studies, for lack of a better word, and the fact that he was a master of Old English, up until sorry, my brain is completely gone. He's one of the most famous English authors of all time, and I've completely forgotten his name.
I mean, all that tells me is that Tolkien is smart and interested in Germanic cultures. I don't see how that.
Well, he doesn't seem to understand that Germanic Anglo-Saxon culture became Christian.
Yeah, it's and that Old English, a lot of Old English stories are Christian.
Well, what I was for some reason I had a complete sort of momentary lapse there. I was thinking of Geoffrey Chaucer, so please admonish me in the chat.
Is that because that's Middle English?
That's sort of the end trajectory of what Tolkien basically considered his realm of interest when it came to English. But yes, I mean, all of these things can intermesh. So just take myself. I'll quickly elucidate. Tolkien's interest. He was very interested in recreating East Germanic languages because they became extinct. He was fascinated in the Gothic peoples. He tried to reconstruct an English identity through philology based on the etymology of Hengist and Horsa. He was interested in late Roman history, hence, the allusions to Flavius Aetius and Theodoric, and yet, of course, the Roman Empire was Christian. I I don't understand how he can't be both. He can't be a philologist and he can't be invested in, and of course, being, incredibly sort of well versed in the sagas, in the Nibelungenlied. And of course, there are many Wagnerian motifs as well, albeit, they come from the same sources. So, what is Gandalf in in a Christian sense, and in Wagner's work he is Valser, and then he is the Wanderer. He has the staff, which is broken by Siegfried. Siegfried almost being the antithesis in some senses of Aragon. So if he's looking for some sort of pagan take on the sources which Tolkien used, there is one that already exists. It's called The Ring of the Nibelungen. It's a 4-part opera series by Richard Wagner. But even then, I think Wagner wasn't so explicitly pagan as some people make him out to be. I mean, Parsifal is an incredibly deep and I would say fundamentally Christian work. So that also doesn't really apply when you think about the implications. And I think actually the more sort of paganistic Schopenhauer sort of influence ideas of Wagner actually are the least effective in terms of the whole sort of thematic arc. But just take myself, for example. I've mentioned Dostoevsky. I adore Russian history. I would say, I probably feel more affinity to Russian history than I do anything else, partly because, I'm a very sort of morbid, nihilistic and dark individual. So I look to see, the utter sort of nadir and suffering of Russia, and I like to sort of contrast it with various moments of pseudo eucatastrophe. That's the sort of thing that appeals to me. But there's very little Catholic in Russian history, and yet I'm able to mesh both. I also love Japanese history, and the Catholics, when they do exist in Japanese history, are almost universally considered the antagonists. So yeah, I mean, a more interesting post I saw a couple of months ago was trying to claim that the only redemptive aspect of all of the characters in Lord of the Rings was Boromir, because Boromir represented some form of pagan archetype. And of course, I actually mentioned to this person who didn't reply, but I ratioed this tweet by explaining that Boromir is just an analogy to the Song of Roland, in which Roland, of course, was the valiant Christian knight and the antagonist to him was a pagan. So all of these attempts to de-Christianize Tolkien just fall flat on their face.
Well said, AM the Wise. I think it's wrap up time. Thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I'm glad we were able to do this. We have plans to come back for a Fourth Age stream, and I think Nathan Hood will be able to join us for that one, which will be a lot of fun. But really, thank you. It's been a great conversation. Are people have to subscribe or to get the Arduanye people would go to your channel and they would become a subscriber, what's the word, supporter?
I mean, I would probably suggest first that there are some videos which are publicly available. I have about sort of 3 or 4 Lord of the Rings videos that are publicly available. I don't really want to shill my channel anymore because I feel very dirty when I do so. But
well, that's why I'm doing it. You're not doing it. I am shilling on your behalf. AM is incredibly, amazing in all of his endeavors, especially within history, of course, but also with his Tolkien stuff. If you want more of what you saw on this episode, please go over to AM's channel if you're not already, coming from his channel, and support him in any way you can. And if you want to support this channel, just please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and tell your friends about it. So anything to say before I go, Am?
No, just to say thank you for those very kind remarks, and thank you very much for having me on, and for suggesting this topic. And you mentioned a fourth-age conversation, and I very much hope that Nathan can join us for that. I look forward to that.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. God bless. Bye.